Des Roches is an associate professor at the Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies at the National Defense University in Washington. David, always a pleasure to have your analysis. About this strike on this school in Luhansk, how difficult is it to identify a target from the air, a building from the air?
It's very difficult. I mean, from the air, you see a building, you don't know what's in the building, you don't know what's going on in the building. So, Russia so far has been somewhat indiscriminate with its targeting in the Ukraine war. But, from the air, all buildings look alike. So normally you have to have other forms of intelligence, like signals intelligence, evidence of military forces going in and out before you take action against it. The other problem that probably contributed to this is that you don't just have regular Russian forces fighting in Luhansk, you also have their proxy militias who lack even the somewhat undisciplined targeting data that the regular Russian forces have. So it's quite possible that they targeted this deliberately, or that they targeted it and thought it was something else.
Is this now the war of attrition that you were expecting in the East? And if it is, what might swing the balance either way?
Yeah, good question. It is looking that way. I think that what Russia's hoping to do is sort of stop sending tanks forward, just fire artillery at the Ukrainians and hope to induce a collapse of Ukrainian logistics, the Ukrainian fighting forces. The Ukrainians, though, are getting modern artillery. And it looks as though the Ukrainians are also meeting with success, pushing the Russian forces out of Kharkiv and moving almost, they're within 6 miles of the Russian border in Kharkiv. So what it looks like is that the Russian forces will have to, they'll have to take some power out of Donetsk, Luhansk, their main effort, and reinforce the areas around Kharkiv. If that happens, there might be a breakthrough on the Russian front. It is quite possible that Ukraine could have a counteroffensive in this region.
Since the start of the conflict, the Ukrainian leadership, Ukrainian politicians, diplomats, they've all been telling the rest of the world, especially Europe, that remember, if Russia wins, you are next. Don't trust the man in the Kremlin. But when you look at it from the other side, David, what are the dangers of a defeated Russia?
Yeah, good question. So I haven't given that a whole lot of thought, but a defeated Russia presumably would be a dangerous Russia. There would be a grievance. Putin already has instilled the narrative that he is fighting for his culture against a conglomeration of forces who want to destroy Russia per se. And, of course, he has complete control over all public communications in Russia. So that narrative will incubate and will grow. However, I think that the safe conclusion is that you already have this sort of malevolent intent. It's better to deal with a malevolent intent with a diminished military capacity than deal with malevolent intent and a strong military capacity.
Okay, well, many people say that the sanctions are already having an effect, that the Russian economy is going to shrink extremely significantly. So Putin's idea of going to war has made his country poorer. It certainly seems to have made his country less secure, especially if Finland and Sweden join the NATO military alliance. What about the mechanics and the mechanisms and the machinations inside the Kremlin if this were to continue, and it were to continue to go against the narrative that Putin was presenting before the war? In other words, how will his closest advisors react? Do you think there's any danger of maybe a coup against Putin?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So when people talk about sanctions, a lot of times people assume that the sole purpose of sanctions is to force regime change. And clearly, when you look at the targeting of oligarchs, most of whom both have gotten rich because of their support of Putin, but who also support Putin. When you see their yachts being seized and London townhouses, the assumption is that eventually they'll turn on Putin. But we really don't know whether, he has them under his thumb or they have the ability to rise up against them. I think a better indication of sanctions is that it's deprived Russia of the ability to really produce modern weaponry. It is really surprising just how dependent they were on Western imports to do things like keep their tank factories running. And we've seen key capabilities like the factory that makes rocket motors for the Smerch rockets has just burned down. Russia will be very hard pressed to get supplies to rebuild these factories. And I think that really has to be the long-term effect of sanctions. Any political stuff is really people are just guessing at.
David, as I said, really appreciate it always. Thank you so much indeed. David Des Roches in Washington.